They didn't wear crowns. They didn't lead armies. They didn't march into cities waving flags or declaring their intentions from cathedral steps. But they conquered more than empires ever could. They shaped minds, controlled memory, bent the course of nations themselves. They were the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, and for centuries, whispers followed them like shadows. Some say they're just educators, missionaries, men devoted to faith and learning. But others claim something different, something darker, that beneath the robes and the rituals, behind the schools and the universities, there exists a network of power so vast, so intricate, so impossible to see, that most people never even realize it's there. I spent years inside their walls, years studying their documents, reading their histories, trying to understand who they really are and what they really want. What I found wasn't simple. It wasn't just good or evil, but it was undeniably powerful. And the deeper I went, the more I realized that the public face of the Jesuits is only half the story. There's another side, a hidden structure, a way of operating that the world barely glimpses. This is what I'm about to reveal. Not conspiracy theory dressed in suspicion, but documented history, careful analysis, pieces of a puzzle that fit together in ways that should terrify anyone who values truth. They have a name for him, whispered in hallways where only initiates pass. The Black Pope, not because of skin or robe colour, but because he operates in shadow while another man stands in light. While the Pope appears on balconies, blessing crowds and waving from windows, another figure commands from behind the scenes. The Superior General of the Society of Jesus holds a power that few people outside the Church understand. By 1614, when their structure solidified, the Jesuits had become a global network with a single point of command. That man, whoever he is at any given moment, answers to the Pope theoretically, but in practice he commands thousands of priests, thousands of schools, thousands of networks spanning every continent. He decides where Jesuits go, what they teach, who they advise, what secrets they keep. I once saw an organizational chart buried in the archives. It looked less like a religious order and more like a corporation, with divisions, territories, reporting structures. The Superior General sits at the apex. Below him, regional superiors. Below them, individual commanders, each one answerable only to the one above. This chain of command never broke. It was designed that way from the beginning. The military precision wasn't accidental. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder, was himself a soldier before he became a priest. He understood hierarchy. He understood discipline. He understood that faith alone wouldn't sustain an organization this large. You needed structure. You needed accountability. You needed men who understood that following orders wasn't just a suggestion, but a duty. The Black Pope has never appeared before crowds. He doesn't give speeches or bless faithful. He doesn't need to. His power operates in whispers, in decisions made in rooms without windows, in letters that never enter public archives. And that invisibility is precisely the point. Most people will never know his name. Most people will never know what he does. And that's exactly how he prefers it. Because visibility dilutes power, and the Superior General understands that better than anyone. He commands through silence. He leads through obscurity. He shapes the world through channels so hidden, so indirect, that historians still argue about whether the Jesuits truly influenced events, or merely stood nearby when important things happened. I was 19 the first time I encountered something that didn't fit the official narrative. I was a young seminarian, eager, believing everything I was taught about the Order's mission of education and salvation. We were touring the historical sections of the compound, the oldest parts, places normally closed to younger members. Our guide was an elderly priest, kind-looking, with tired eyes that had seen too much history, too many secrets, too many uncomfortable truths. As we passed through a particular corridor, I noticed a series of doors, each one sealed, locked, unmarked. I asked what was behind them. The old priest paused. He looked at me for a long moment, then smiled in a way that wasn't quite a smile. He said, "Some doors stay closed for reasons." That phrase haunted me. Why would a door need to stay closed? If the work was righteous, if the mission was pure, why the secrecy? I pressed him later, alone. He warned me gently but firmly. "There are truths layered upon truths," he said. "The surface truth serves the masses, but below that, there are other truths, harder truths. They're not meant to disturb the foundation of faith. They're meant to protect it." I didn't understand then, but over the years, as I read more, as I studied deeper, I began to see what he meant. The Jesuits operate on multiple levels of truth simultaneously. What's told to the schools is different from what's told to the bishops. What's told to the bishops is different from what's told to the inner circle. It's not deception exactly. It's compartmentalization. It's the belief that different truths serve different purposes, that the full picture would be too much for most people to bear. The fourth vow exists, but not the way conspiracy theories describe it. Most people know 3 vows: poverty, chastity, obedience, but there is a fourth, and it's spoken of rarely, in whispers, hidden in documents few will ever see. It's the vow that binds a Jesuit directly to the Pope, not to God, though they would argue it's ultimately the same, to the Pope himself. A vow that says, "I will go where I am sent, I will do what I am asked, I will not question." This vow transforms a man. It makes him not just a priest, but something else, an instrument, a tool. I read testimonies from men who had taken it years after they left the order. They described a weight, a sense that part of their will no longer belonged to them, that they had signed over their autonomy in the name of faith. But here's what matters. The vow is real, but the conspiracy theories about it are exaggerated. The vow doesn't make Jesuits into mindless automatons. It doesn't grant them supernatural powers. It simply creates a level of obedience that most organizations would envy, a binding commitment to follow orders. That's powerful enough without embellishment. That's what makes it actually frightening. Not because it's magical or impossible, but because it's so mundane, so reasonable sounding, so easy to justify. A soldier takes vows, a spy takes vows, an intelligence agent takes vows. And that's what the fourth vow creates, not monks, soldiers in robes. The Society of Jesus was founded in 1534 by a Basque nobleman named Ignatius of Loyola. He was a former soldier wounded in battle who experienced a spiritual awakening while recovering. Everything about his founding reflects that military background. The order was built like an army. It had officers and ranks and a clear chain of command. It had discipline and training and rigid standards. Ignatius called Jesuits soldiers of God, and he meant it literally. The training was intense, designed to break down individual will and rebuild it as part of something larger. Young men entering the order underwent what was essentially military conditioning, wrapped in religious language. They were taught obedience, sacrifice, the subordination of personal desire to institutional mission. They were taught languages for the expansion of church influence. They were taught rhetoric for persuasion. They were taught history for the manipulation of memory. By the time a Jesuit took his vows, he wasn't just a man anymore. He was an instrument precisely calibrated to serve a particular purpose. And that purpose, while clothed in theology, was ultimately about power, about influence, about the expansion and maintenance of institutional control. The military structure allowed the Jesuits to move with precision through European society in ways the rest of the church couldn't. They weren't bound to one place like diocesan priests. They could be deployed, sent where they were needed, recalled when they were done. This flexibility, combined with their discipline and intelligence, made them invaluable to the papacy and terrifying to those who opposed them. Confessions became their intelligence network. Every Catholic confesses sins to a priest. That means every Catholic reveals secrets, fears, crimes, desires, weaknesses. The Jesuits understood the power of this. They positioned themselves as confessors to the wealthy and powerful. Kings confessed to Jesuits, nobles confessed to Jesuits. Merchants, generals, politicians, they all came with their secrets. And the Jesuits listened, remembered, filed it away in minds trained by decades of discipline to retain information. The seal of confession prevented them from speaking outside the booth, but nothing prevented them from using what they learned to advise their superiors, to guide policy, to influence decisions from behind the scenes. I found records of confession networks, lists of priests assigned to specific locations specifically because important men confessed there. It wasn't written as such in the documents, but the pattern was unmistakable. A Jesuit would be placed in a wealthy parish. High-ranking men would confess to him. Information would flow back through the chain of command. Decisions would be made based on that intelligence. In essence, the confessional became a tool of statecraft. The seal of confession protected the people confessing, but also protected the intelligence operation itself. No one could accuse the Jesuits of breaking the seal, because technically they never did. But they didn't have to speak the secrets aloud to act on them. They used what they heard to shape the world, one decision at a time. This is why the Jesuits were so valuable to the Vatican. They weren't just spiritual advisors, they were information gatherers, spies in the robes of priesthood. The first Jesuit college opened in 1548 in Messina, Sicily. Within a generation, there were dozens. Within a century, there were hundreds. By 1749, the Jesuits were running 669 colleges across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. This explosion wasn't accidental, it was strategic. Education was the tool of choice. If you control what children learn, you control what they believe, what they value, what they accept as true. The Jesuits understood this before modern psychology even had a name for it. They built schools that became the best in their regions. Wealthy families sent their sons there, sometimes their daughters. These students became the leaders of tomorrow, future bishops, future politicians, future merchants. By the time they entered the world, they carried Jesuit principles with them. They thought like Jesuits. They saw the world through a lens ground by Jesuit hands. I saw curricula from these schools. The subjects were standard enough: Latin, Greek, mathematics, theology. But the way they were taught carried a message, a particular worldview, an acceptance of hierarchy, of authority, of the Church's role as mediator between God and man. The schools weren't just teaching facts, they were teaching obedience dressed as knowledge. The Jesuits developed something called the Ratio Studiorum, a standardized educational model used across all their schools. It was revolutionary for its time. Standardized curriculum meant standardized thinking. A student in Rome learned the same subjects the same way as a student in India. The textbooks were identical. The methods were identical. The values transmitted were identical. This created a global network of young minds, all trained to think similarly, to accept similar authority structures, to respect similar hierarchies. The Ratio Studiorum wasn't just a curriculum. It was a template for creating loyalty to the institutional church across generations and continents. I read through the documents. The language is pedagogical, seemingly innocent, but underneath runs a current of strategic intention. Students learn scripture, but a particular interpretation. They learn history, but a particular narrative. They learn philosophy, but a particular framework. Contradictions are explained away. Alternative viewpoints are presented only to be refuted. By the time a young man finished a Jesuit education, he had been carefully shaped to accept the Church's authority without questioning it. The schools operated like machines for producing consent, not through coercion but through education, through the careful, systematic presentation of ideas designed to limit the range of what seemed possible to believe. The reductions of Paraguay represent one of the most complex examples of Jesuit mission work. In the 1600s, Jesuits established communities in Paraguay and Brazil designed to protect indigenous people and bring them into the Christian faith. These were called reductions, organized communities that looked like nothing the indigenous Guarani had ever experienced. European architecture, European organization, European hierarchy. The Jesuits presented them as havens, places of safety from Spanish exploitation. And they were, in a sense. The Jesuits did protect indigenous people from slavery and harsh colonial labor, but they also transformed them, removed them from their own cultures, their own languages, their own spiritual practices, replaced all of it with Catholicism and European customs. Modern historians debate the morality of this. Some call it humanitarian, others call it cultural genocide. What's certain is that it demonstrated Jesuit method. We will save you, they said. We will protect you. But the price is your world. Give it up. Become like us. Think like us. Worship like us. The indigenous people who survived the reductions were no longer fully themselves. They weren't Spanish. They weren't European. They were something new. Something created by Jesuit design. This model repeated across the globe, in China, in Japan, in India. The specifics changed, but the pattern remained. The Jesuits would arrive, build community, promise protection, deliver conversion, and in the process reshape entire populations to fit Jesuit ideals. It's powerful work and troubling, because it reveals that beneath the humanitarian language lay something else, a mission to remake the world in the Church's image. In 1773, something shook the foundations of Jesuit power. Pope Clement XIV, under intense pressure from Catholic monarchs in Spain, Portugal, and France, issued a papal brief suppressing the Society of Jesus. The Jesuits were ordered to renounce their vows and disperse. Over 22,000 men were suddenly told they were no longer Jesuits. Over 1,000 schools and residences were closed or transferred. It was the most dramatic blow to the order's existence, and the reasons remain contested. Officially, the monarchs claimed the Jesuits had become too powerful, too independent, too much of a threat to royal authority. There were financial disputes over missionary lands in Paraguay. There were accusations of involvement in political intrigue. There was general resentment of the order's influence over education and confession. But the real reason was simpler. The Catholic monarchies wanted control. They wanted the Church subordinate to the state. The Jesuits, with their direct obedience to the Pope, represented a competing loyalty. So the monarchs pressured the Pope until he had no choice. He suppressed them. What's mysterious is what happened next. The order didn't die, it went underground. In Russia, Catherine the Great refused to recognize the suppression. She harbored Jesuits, protected them, allowed them to continue functioning. In other places, Jesuits simply took off their robes, changed their names, continued their work in secret. For 41 years, the Society of Jesus officially did not exist, but it persisted, it adapted, it survived. Which raises a question. If an organization can simply disappear and reappear unchanged, how much did suppression really matter? If they continued operating in secret with barely a ripple, what does that tell us about their true nature? The years of suppression revealed something about Jesuit organization that's rarely discussed. They didn't collapse. There was no panic, no desperate scrambling. The order simply shifted into a different mode. In Russia, they continued their schools and their missions under Catherine's protection. In other countries, individual Jesuits worked quietly, maintaining networks, waiting. It's almost as if the suppression was expected, as if contingency plans had been made. I found references to something called the hidden structure, documents that suggested the order had always maintained an underground capacity, a way to function if the public organization was ever disrupted. It's a hypothesis, difficult to prove, but the evidence suggests that the Jesuits were prepared for exactly what happened. They didn't panic because they had never relied entirely on institutional recognition. They had built themselves to survive suppression, to adapt, to continue. This capacity to function outside official channels, while maintaining connection to the original mission is what distinguishes the Jesuits from normal religious organizations. They're more resilient, more prepared for change, more willing to operate in shadows if necessary. It raises a disturbing possibility that the organization visible to the world is only the surface, that the real work happens elsewhere, that what we see is merely what they allow us to see. In 1814, Pope Pius VII restored the Society of Jesus. It was 41 years after the suppression. The world had changed dramatically. The French Revolution had shaken Europe. The Enlightenment had transformed thinking, and the Jesuits returned not as a restoration, but as an adaptation. The order was reborn smaller, but more focused, more determined. In the following decades, they rebuilt their educational network. They re-established their missions. They reasserted their influence on European intellectual life. But something had changed. They were more careful now, more aware of limits. They adapted their methods to survive in a world that was no longer willing to grant the Church unlimited authority. The Jesuits who returned from suppression were a different order than the one that had been suppressed. They had learned, they had watched, they had waited in shadows, and they understood that power operates differently in a modern world. Direct control was no longer possible, so they worked through other means, through education, through confession, through the intellectual influence of their brilliant minds, through proximity to power rather than direct wielding of it. The Restoration didn't return the Jesuits to dominance, but it returned them to relevance, and from that restoration flows everything they have become since. The position of confessor to the powerful was always crucial to Jesuit strategy. By the 1600s, Jesuits served as confessors to kings and emperors across Europe. They knew the secrets of courts. They understood the inner workings of power. They could whisper advice into the ear of the most powerful men alive. Your Majesty, the will of God seems to be pointing toward a peace with France. Your Majesty, your conscience appears troubled about this policy. Subtle, indirect, but powerful. The confessor influences without commanding. He advises without appearing to advise. He shapes decisions while maintaining the fiction that the ruler is acting independently. This is the highest form of manipulation. Not force, not obvious control, but the gentle reshaping of consciousness through access to our innermost confessions of power. I read accounts from various courts. Jesuits appear again and again as the trusted advisors, the ones who knew everything because kings confessed everything to them. This gave the Jesuits a form of power that was almost impossible to see or combat. You couldn't accuse a priest of undue influence when he was simply doing his spiritual duty. You couldn't claim the confessor was manipulating the king when he was merely responding to the king's conscience, but the effect was real. Policies were shaped, alliances were formed, wars were influenced, and the Jesuits moved like invisible hands across the machinery of state, their fingerprints visible only to those who knew how to look. Casuistry became the Jesuit method for navigating ethical complexity. It's the art of resolving moral cases through careful reasoning and interpretation of principles. In theory, it's a legitimate theological tool, but in practice, in Jesuit hands, it became something else, a way to justify almost anything through sufficiently complex reasoning. Is it permissible to lie to advance the faith? Through casuistry, yes, if the lie serves a greater good. Is it acceptable to assassinate a heretical ruler? Through careful reasoning, yes, if the ruler threatens the church. Is espionage acceptable? Through proper interpretation, yes, because the end justifies the means, if the end is the glory of God and the authority of the church. I read Jesuit moral texts that twisted themselves into knots, trying to justify increasingly questionable behaviours, not through explicit statement, but through careful reasoning, exception-making, principle interpretation. The effect was to create a moral framework where almost nothing was truly forbidden if you had the right theological justification. This isn't unique to the Jesuits, but they perfected it. They weaponized it. They used it to argue that deception, violence, manipulation, all could be acceptable under the proper circumstances. This created a moral structure where institutional loyalty could override conventional ethics, where serving the Church's mission transcended normal morality. It's a dangerous framework, and it explains much about how Jesuits could justify behaviours that would be considered wrong in any other context. Assassination allegations followed the Jesuits through centuries of history. They've been accused of involvement in murders, poisonings, destabilisation campaigns. Some accusations are clearly false. Some are born from anti-Catholic propaganda, but some contain elements of historical fact. The Jesuits did assist in the Inquisition. They did carry out intelligence operations. They did advise on matters of state security and espionage. The leap from these historical facts to direct involvement in assassinations is larger than the evidence supports. Yet the allegations persist. They persist because the Jesuits had the means, the motivation, and the organisational capacity to carry out such operations if they chose to. They persist because the order's secrecy makes it difficult to prove or disprove definitively. They persist because the Jesuits themselves never fully transparent about their historical activities. I found references to something called special missions, tasks assigned by the Pope directly to the Superior General, never written down in full, never disclosed, just whispered instructions that certain men, certain situations required special handling. What exactly special handling meant was never spelled out. That ambiguity is, in a way, the point. The mystery itself creates power. Whether or not the Jesuits actually assassinated specific individuals becomes less important than the fact that people believe they might have. The suspicion, the fear, the uncertainty all serve to enhance the order's aura of danger and hidden capability. The Monitor Secreta, the secret instructions, is a document that purports to reveal the true hidden methods of the Jesuits. It was supposedly written by a Jesuit insider and leaked to expose the order's unethical practices. In the document, the Jesuits are portrayed as systematically acquiring wealth through manipulation, spying on their members, concealing their true methods from the public. It's a damning document. It's also probably a forgery. Scholars have debated its authenticity for centuries. It appears to have been written not by a Jesuit, but by an enemy of the order, designed to discredit them through exposure of alleged secret methods. Yet the document persists. It's cited as evidence of Jesuit conspiracy. It's quoted in anti-Catholic literature. It shaped how people thought about the Jesuits for generations across centuries. Scholars still argue about it. Anti-Catholic activists still point to it. And here's the thing. Whether the document is authentic or not, whether the methods it describes are real or fabricated, the effect is identical. It created a narrative, a story about hidden Jesuit methods and secret instructions guiding their behaviour. A framework for understanding the order that no amount of evidence can fully dispel. That narrative became more real to many people than whatever the actual truth was. This is how conspiracy theories work. Not through ironclad evidence, but through the creation of plausible narratives that fill in the gaps in what we know. The Monitor Secreta is perhaps the perfect example. A document so perfect in its revelations, so thoroughly structured in its accusations, so complete in its portrait of Jesuit malfeasance that it had to be true. Except probably it wasn't. But that didn't matter. The story stuck. And yet the stories persist. The accusations return again and again across centuries. Why? Because patterns suggest themselves. Because the Jesuits did have the capacity. Because the line between capable and culpable gets blurry in historical fog. The allegations of Jesuit involvement in assassinations fill entire books. They killed kings. They poisoned popes. They orchestrated the fall of empires. Some of these claims have roots in real events. The Jesuits did collaborate with the Inquisition. They served as confessors to monarchs during politically volatile times. They maintained networks of intelligence across continents. but the leap from proximity to crime is vast. Yet what matters is not necessarily what they did, but what people believed they could do. Because belief shapes policy. Belief shapes how rulers treated them, how nations responded to them, how fear of their power became almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. A king might suppress them not because they actually committed murder, but because he feared they might. That fear was enough to change history. I found references to what some called the Jesuit hand in various historical turning points. Assassination attempts that failed mysteriously, political shifts that seemed orchestrated, wars that started and stopped according to patterns no one could quite explain. None of it was proven, none of it was definitive, but all of it was possible, and that possibility was the real power. The Jesuits didn't need to actually kill kings to benefit from the fear that they might. When Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, the whispers began immediately. Jesuits killed him. The accusations spread through certain circles. Lincoln had opposed Catholic expansion in America. He had supported Republican ideals that conflicted with papal authority. He had made enemies of powerful men connected to Rome. Therefore, Jesuits killed him. The evidence was circumstantial at best, fabricated at worst, but the narrative stuck. Books were written, pamphlets were distributed. For generations, certain communities believed that Jesuit assassins had struck down a president because he threatened their plans. The truth was more complicated. John Wilkes Booth was a Confederate sympathizer. The assassination had political and personal motives rooted in the American Civil War, not Vatican. An intrigue, but history doesn't always listen to truth. History listens to stories. And the Lincoln assassination fed the narrative of Jesuit malevolence. It became proof, in some minds, that they operated at the highest levels of American power. They had killed a president. What couldn't they do? This belief influenced policy for decades. Anti-Catholic sentiment surged. Jesuit institutions were scrutinized. Political figures took positions specifically to oppose Jesuit influence. Whether the assassination had anything to do with Rome became almost irrelevant. The story was real enough to reshape American history. And that's the genius of conspiracy narratives. They don't require truth. They require only plausibility and enough believers to make them consequential. The question of CIA involvement with Jesuits has haunted intelligence analysts for decades. During the Cold War, the United States needed allies everywhere. The Jesuits had networks in every country where the Americans wanted to operate. They had access to confession booths, to educational institutions, to the highest levels of government. Did the CIA recruit Jesuits? Did they work together? The official answer is no. But the unofficial answer lives in classified documents that will never be released. I knew a retired intelligence officer once. He wouldn't speak directly about Jesuits, but he said something I never forgot. He said certain religious organizations provided resources that intelligence agencies could never develop on their own, not because they were complicit, but because their existing networks could be activated for geopolitical purposes. The Jesuits had been activating networks for centuries. It would have been natural for American intelligence to recognize the value. What happened in Latin America in the 1970s and 1980s remains murky. Jesuit priests were assassinated by military regimes. Jesuit institutions were attacked. But some historians wonder whether American agencies and Jesuit networks had shared interests, shared operations, shared enemies. The Jesuits spoke of liberation theology, of empowering the poor. The Americans wanted to prevent communist expansion. Did they work together? Did they work at cross purposes? The truth is buried in archives that may never be opened. What remains is suspicion, questions, patterns that suggest connections without proving them. And in the absence of proof, imagination fills the gaps. People believe what seems possible. And intelligence operations seem entirely possible when carried out by men who have spent centuries perfecting the art of working in shadows. Liberation theology emerged in Latin America in the 1960s and 1970s as a radical reinterpretation of Christianity. Priests and theologians, many Jesuits, began preaching that Christ's message was fundamentally about justice for the poor. They worked alongside indigenous communities, peasants, the dispossessed. They demanded structural change. They challenged the existing order. The Vatican didn't like it. The conservative leadership saw liberation theology as communism wrapped in scripture. They saw Jesuits embracing ideas that threatened the established hierarchy, so they moved against it. Jesuits who promoted liberation theology were reassigned. Their writings were condemned. Some were removed from the priesthood entirely. It was a purge, though the church wouldn't call it that. It was a correction, they said. But what it really was suppression of a movement that threatened to democratize faith, to put power in the hands of the poor rather than the institutional church. I found letters from Rome to Jesuit superiors. Read between the lines and the message was clear. Stop this. Stop the liberation theology. Stop empowering the poor to question the system. Return to orthodoxy. Return to hierarchy. The Jesuits who resisted were punished. The ones who complied were elevated. By the 1980s, liberation theology had been largely crushed. The dream of a church that served the poor rather than the powerful had been contained. And the Jesuits, despite many of them embracing liberation theology, ultimately served the institution because that's what they were trained to do. That's what the fourth vow meant. When the Vatican commanded, they obeyed, even when obedience meant abandoning their own prophetic mission. The Superior General, the Black Pope, continues to command vast networks even today. He sits somewhere in Rome, in offices that few people ever enter. From there, he directs the operations of 15,000 Jesuits across 112 countries. That's 15,000 trained men, committed to obedience, connected by networks that span the globe. What they do individually is often visible. They teach in universities, they work in parishes, they serve in hospitals, but their coordination, their unified purpose, that remains hidden. The Superior General issues directives that flow through regional superiors to individual priests. Some directives are about spiritual matters, others are about where Jesuits should position themselves, which universities to influence, which governments to engage. The decisions are made quietly, without public announcement, but the effects ripple through institutions, through education, through the shaping of young minds. I knew a Jesuit once who told me that the order had never stopped thinking strategically. They still mapped the world like military tacticians. They still identified the places where influence mattered most. They still positioned people accordingly. The Black Pope doesn't command assassins or spy networks anymore, if he ever did. But he commands influence, he commands access, he commands the loyalty of men trained from youth to see institutional obedience as a form of holiness. And in a world where information and ideas shape policy more than weapons do, that's still an extraordinary form of power. Invisible, distributed, difficult to oppose, and entirely legal. In March 2013, Jorge Mario Bergoglio became Pope Francis, becoming the first Jesuit to lead the Catholic Church. The irony was profound. The Black Pope was now the White Pope. The Superior General's order was now led by one of their own. Conspiracy theorists went wild. Finally, they said, the Jesuits have openly claimed the papacy. Finally, the hidden hand is revealed. But it's more complicated than that. Pope Francis brought with him a Jesuit sensibility. He emphasized poverty, service to the poor, humility. He spoke of the Church needing to serve humanity rather than demanding obedience. He criticized greed and institutional power. On the surface, it seemed like a victory for liberation theology, for the prophetic tradition the Jesuits had partly abandoned. But underneath, structural power remained unchanged. The hierarchy persisted. The institutional church continued accumulating wealth. Francis spoke of reform, while the system remained largely unreformed. He was a Jesuit, trained in obedience, ultimately bound by the same constraints as his predecessors. The Jesuits didn't infiltrate the papacy with Francis. They revealed something that had perhaps always been true, that the Church's leadership has always shared Jesuit sensibilities, that Jesuit thinking had always influenced papal decisions, that the distinction between the society and the Church was always less clear than it appeared. Francis is complicated. He seems genuinely devoted to the poor, but he's also led an institution with billions in assets. He speaks of justice while overseeing injustice. He's a man caught between prophetic calling and institutional responsibility. And in that tension, we see the fundamental contradiction of the Jesuits themselves. The oath attributed to Jesuits, the one that supposedly binds them to absolute obedience to the Pope and commits them to whatever means necessary to advance church power, has been circulating for centuries. It's been printed on pamphlets, quoted by anti-Catholic activists, republished in conspiracy books. The oath explicitly says things like, Jesuits will kill Protestants, destroy nations, stop at nothing. It's devastating if true. It's also almost certainly false. Historians have thoroughly debunked it. There is no such oath. The documents are forgeries or misquotations or fragments taken out of context, yet the oath persists. It continues to be cited as evidence of Jesuit evil. And here's the thing. The actual Jesuit vows are damning enough without fabrication. The real fourth vow binding Jesuits to absolute obedience to the Pope is powerful. It creates a structure of authority that most organizations would envy. It creates commitment that transcends normal human loyalties. That's true. That's documented. That's real. So why fabricate more? Why create false oaths when the true ones are extraordinary enough? The answer is that conspiracy thinking doesn't care about truth. It cares about narrative. A false oath that perfectly crystallizes the fear works better than a complicated truth that requires nuance. The fabricated oath is propaganda, but it's propaganda aimed at people who already believe the basic premise. They believe Jesuits are dangerous. The false oath confirms what they already know, and truth becomes almost irrelevant. What matters is the story that circulates. What matters is what people believe. The real Jesuit vows are strange and demanding enough. They don't need embellishment, but embellishment makes them simpler to understand, easier to fear, more convenient for political purposes. Wealth flows through Jesuit networks in ways that remain largely invisible. The order owns real estate across the globe, universities worth hundreds of millions, medical institutions, publishing companies, schools in virtually every country. The individual Jesuits take vows of poverty, living modest lives, but the institution itself is wealthy, extraordinarily wealthy, and that wealth gives power. Georgetown University alone is worth billions. Fordham University is worth more. And there are dozens of other institutions, each substantial, each connected to the Society of Jesus. The money flows through channels that aren't always transparent. Donations to the order, tuition payments to universities, endowments from wealthy benefactors who want Jesuit education for their children, grants from governments and foundations. The Jesuits don't publicize financial details. The order maintains a veil of mystery around its operations. How much money actually flows through? Where does it go? What percentage stays in the order itself versus supporting educational institutions? These questions are rarely answered transparently. I found fragmentary records suggesting that the financial networks are sophisticated. Money moves between countries, it's invested, it grows. Some of it seems to disappear entirely into accounts that serve purposes no one outside the order fully understands. Is there embezzlement, corruption, misuse of funds? The evidence is circumstantial, but the opportunity exists. The infrastructure for financial misconduct is there, and that possibility, combined with institutional secrecy, breeds suspicion. The Jesuits control wealth that rivals nations. They operate without the transparency required of governments. They answer to no one but the Pope. That combination of power and secrecy has historically created corruption. Whether it has in this case remains unknown. Science has always been dangerous to institutional power. The more people understand how the universe actually works, the less they need priests to explain it. The Jesuits understood this, so they did something clever. They infiltrated science. They became astronomers and mathematicians and physicians. By the 1700s, Jesuit astronomers ran observatories across the globe. They made genuine discoveries. They contributed to actual knowledge, but they also maintained gatekeepers' roles. What was discovered got filtered through institutional authority. What was allowed to be published got determined by Jesuits sitting on review boards. The Gregorian calendar, one of the most significant scientific achievements of the Renaissance, was a Jesuit accomplishment. Christopher Clavius, a Jesuit, led the work. But notice what happened. The calendar was presented not as a triumph of mathematics, but as divine revelation. It was framed religiously, even though it was fundamentally scientific. This pattern repeated across Jesuit science. Discoveries were made, but they were always contextualized within religious frameworks. Knowledge was presented not as liberation, but as deeper understanding of God's creation. The effect was to control how knowledge was used, how it was understood, what conclusions people drew. If astronomy is the study of God's heavens, then questioning church cosmology becomes blasphemy. If medicine is God's healing art, then rejecting priestly blessing becomes sinful. The Jesuits used science as a tool of control, not through suppression, but through sophisticated integration of knowledge and theology. They became so good at it that people couldn't distinguish between scientific knowledge and religious interpretation. That's extraordinary power, and it remains largely unacknowledged in histories of science. The Vatican Observatory sits on the papal residence grounds in Rome, a remarkable facility dedicated to astronomical observation. The Jesuits used to run it. They made discoveries that advanced understanding of the cosmos, but observers have wondered whether the observatory served another purpose, whether the Jesuits were mapping something more than stars, whether astronomical observations translated into other forms of knowledge. Some conspiracy theorists claim the Vatican Observatory searches for evidence of extraterrestrial life, or divine secrets written in the heavens. These claims are almost certainly false, but they're false about something that's true. The observatory did represent Jesuit engagement with deep knowledge, with the mysteries of existence, with information that transcended normal human understanding. The Jesuits studied the stars and kept records. They observed phenomena that most people never glimpsed. They possessed knowledge that remained largely hidden. Whether that knowledge was astronomical or something else becomes almost secondary. What matters is the principle. The Jesuits positioned themselves as gatekeepers of cosmic knowledge. They controlled access to telescopes and records. They interpreted what the heavens revealed. In an age when the heavens were mysteries, that put them in an extraordinary position, and the secrecy around their observations, the veil of technical language, the restriction of access, all of it created an aura of hidden knowledge. Maybe they found nothing extraordinary. Maybe they found everything, but few people outside the order ever truly knew. The Jesuits have survived suppression, exile, reformation, revolution. Repeatedly, governments have tried to destroy them. Repeatedly, they've persisted. Why? Because they learned how to adapt. They learned how to function in multiple modes, openly when possible, underground when necessary, officially when advantageous, unofficially when required. This flexibility is their survival mechanism. A normal organization needs visible structure to function. It needs buildings and titles and public roles. But the Jesuits can operate without these things. They can be dispersed, renamed, reactivated. They can wait. They can maintain networks undercover. They can re-emerge when conditions change. Catherine the Great's protection of Jesuits during the suppression kept 200 of them functioning in Russia for 41 years. When the order was officially restored in 1814, Those Jesuits became the seed for a new growth. The adaptation was almost biological. The organism learned how to survive in hostile environments, to go dormant, to re-emerge. This capacity for metamorphosis is what makes the Jesuits different from other institutions. They're not vulnerable to the destruction that ends most organizations. They can be dismantled and reconstituted. They can be suppressed and restored. They've done it multiple times, which means they could do it again, which means predictions about their decline or irrelevance are probably premature. The Jesuits are still adapting, still positioning themselves, still thinking strategically about the next century. What that adaptation looks like, what form it takes, remains unclear, but the pattern is clear. The Jesuits survive. Missions remain the public face of Jesuit work, the most visible manifestation of their global presence. Jesuits serve in 112 countries now. They run schools, universities, hospitals, parishes. They work with the poor. They serve as chaplains. They're visible in ways that other parts of the organization aren't. But missions have always been more complex than charity. They've always been about expansion of Christian reach, yes, but also about gathering intelligence, about cultural infiltration, about reshaping societies according to Christian ideals. The Paraguay reductions were humanitarian missions that also transformed indigenous culture. The Jesuit missions in China were educational and also served to position Jesuits as bridges between cultures. The missions in Africa have been about serving communities, but also about advancing the Church's influence on a continent of vast spiritual resources. None of this is necessarily sinister. This is what missions are supposed to do. But it means the Jesuits are never just doing charity. They're always also advancing institutional interests, always also gathering intelligence, always also positioning themselves for future influence. Modern Jesuit missions maintain this dual character. They serve refugees, they feed the hungry, they work for justice, but they also build relationships with power structures. They establish presences in strategic locations. They create networks that transcend the immediate charitable mission. I once met a Jesuit missionary who had worked in Latin America. He seemed genuinely devoted to serving the poor. But when I asked about his reports to Rome, about coordination with other Jesuits, his answers became guarded. The work was bigger than charity, he implied. It was always bigger. The Jesuits understand that influence is built slowly through repeated presence, through relationships, through being somewhere consistently. Missions provide the infrastructure for that long-term positioning. Charity is the means, influence is the end. Memory is an objective. It's malleable. It can be shaped through repetition, through controlling what gets recorded, through determining which stories survive. The Jesuits understood this from the beginning. They became masters of memory. They kept meticulous records. They controlled which texts were copied. They determined which histories would be preserved and which would be lost. This is the art of memory elevated to institutional strategy. Medieval mnemonic techniques, the methods for remembering vast quantities of information, they studied these intensely. They trained young Jesuits to memorize scripture, to internalize entire systems of knowledge. But they were also training them to control how information flowed, how memory worked, how society remembered what mattered. I found references to something called the Jesuit method in controlling historical memory. It wasn't about destroying records. It was about being the ones who preserved them, interpreted them, made them available or unavailable as circumstances required. If Jesuits controlled the archives, they controlled history. If Jesuits trained the scribes, they shaped the narrative. If Jesuits educated the leaders, those leaders would remember the world according to Jesuit frameworks. This sounds like conspiracy, but it's just institutional power applied to the domain of knowledge. Every institution tries to shape how it's remembered. The Jesuits were just extraordinarily successful at it. They understood that the present is shaped by which past we remember. So they invested enormously in determining what gets remembered, by whom, and how. The result is that Jesuit history is largely written by Jesuits. That's not surprising, but it's also not neutral. Every institutional history is written by the winners. The Jesuits won in the domain of record keeping, so the past reflects their preferences. The Counter-Reformation was a Catholic response to Protestant challenge. The Church was losing ground. Protestants were winning souls. Rome needed fighters. The Jesuits became those fighters. They were soldiers of Christ deployed into an ideological war. They were trained rhetorically. They were trained theologically. They were trained to win arguments and convince minds. They became scholars and preachers and writers. They dominated the intellectual battlefield. But they also remained fundamentally military in structure. Hierarchy, discipline, chain of command, clear enemies, unified purpose. The Counter-Reformation wasn't about gentle theology. It was about aggressive recovery of lost power. And the Jesuits excelled at aggression wrapped in religious language. They used missionary work as expansion. They used education as indoctrination. They used confession as intelligence gathering. Every tool available became weaponized in service of institutional recovery. By the end of the Counter-Reformation, the Catholics had stopped the bleeding. They'd stabilized their position. The Protestant world hadn't completely conquered. And the Jesuits had played a central role in that defense. That success established their reputation. The Vatican learned that the Jesuits could be deployed to solve problems, could be trusted with sensitive missions, could be relied upon to maintain institutional loyalty even under pressure. That reputation persists. Centuries later, Jesuits are still seen as problem solvers for the Church, still trusted with sensitive work, still deployed when the institution faces challenges. They're warriors in robes, and the robes aren't decoration. They're camouflage. What do they still guard? What secrets remain locked in those vaults beneath Rome? The obvious answers are probably wrong. It's probably not ancient documents proving aliens, or proving Jesus married, or proving that God doesn't exist. Conspiracy theorists want spectacular secrets. They want revelations that would shatter everything. But the real secrets are probably quieter and more damaging in their own way. Financial records showing vast wealth accumulated through questionable means. Intelligence files on thousands of confessions that could blackmail powerful people. Documentation of complicity in crimes committed by allies. Records of suppressed movements within the Church. Evidence of moral failures by institutional leadership. The terrifying thing about institutional secrets is usually not that they're spectacularly wrong, it's that they reveal the institution to be ordinary, human, fallible, corrupt in mundane ways. The Vatican probably doesn't guard cosmic secrets. It guards the evidence of its own compromises, its own betrayals of its stated ideals, its own transformation of spiritual calling into institutional power. And that's secret enough. That's damaging enough. Because if people truly understood how much of the Church's authority rests on hidden failures, on suppressed scandals, on the systematic burial of inconvenient truths, the whole structure might begin to crumble. Not because people would lose faith in God, but because they would lose faith in the institution claiming to represent God. And the institution cannot allow that. So it keeps the secrets, locked in vaults, protected by walls, guarded by men trained in obedience and institutional loyalty. And as long as the secrets remain hidden, the illusion of infallibility persists. The story of the Jesuits is not a story of simple evil. It's not a story of heroes either. It's a story of power, of how men with extraordinary discipline and clarity of purpose can shape the world, of how institutions survive by adapting, of how the line between serving faith and serving power becomes almost invisible over centuries. The Jesuits did genuinely good things. They educated millions. They protected indigenous peoples from exploitation. They advanced science. They spoke for the poor, but they also accumulated power. They also shaped societies according to their vision. They also maintained hierarchies that serve institutions over people. Both things are true. The Jesuits exist in contradiction, like most human institutions do. What matters is not whether they're good or evil, but whether we understand them, whether we see how they operate, whether we recognize the mechanisms of power they've perfected. Because understanding is the only defense against manipulation. When you see how something works, it loses some of its power to control you. The conspiracy theories about Jesuits are mostly wrong, but they point at something true. They point at an institution that wields enormous influence while remaining largely invisible. That trains men in obedience, that thinks strategically, that plays a long game, that survives suppression and adaptation, that positions itself in places of power and authority, and that shapes how knowledge is understood and transmitted. Whether they're assassinating presidents or controlling intelligence agencies, the conspiracy theories probably exaggerate. But the underlying reality is extraordinary enough without exaggeration. An order of 15,000 men across the globe, trained to obey, positioned in universities and governments and institutions of power, working according to a strategic vision set by a superior general who answers to the Pope. That's not a conspiracy. That's how institutions operate. And the Jesuits are among the most sophisticated institutions on earth.